The pool key showdown. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the shouting, it was the silence. The kind of heavy neighborhood silence that falls when blinds start moving and people pretend they're not watching. I was sitting by my pool on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sunlight reflecting off the water, thinking it was just another peaceful day in our lakeside HOA community. Then I heard heels clicking aggressively across the concrete. Not walking, not strolling, marching. When I looked up, there she was. Red blazer, tight smile, folder clutched like it contained nuclear codes. Her Karen, and she wasn't alone. She stopped 3 feet from my chair and didn't even greet me. No hello, no small talk, just straight to the accusation. "You violated community pool regulations," she snapped, holding out her hand. "Hand over your pool keys immediately. Now, understand something. This wasn't the shared neighborhood pool. This was my private backyard pool, built with permits, approved by the city, fully legal." But in her mind, the HOA ruled over gravity itself. I calmly asked her what rule I'd supposedly broken. She flipped through her folder dramatically and claimed, "I was hosting unauthorized gatherings." I looked around. It was just me, a book, and a glass of iced tea. But Karen wasn't there for logic. She was there for dominance. She leaned closer and lowered her voice like she was delivering a final warning. "If you don't comply," she said, "I'll escalate this." And that's when I realized this wasn't about pool keys. This was about control. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that escalation was a game. I understood far better than she did. Because the badge she was about to call for backup, it wasn't going to intimidate me. It was going to expose her. And when her backup finally arrived, the entire neighborhood learned the difference between fake authority and federal power. The cop husband arrives. If Karen thought her words would scare me, she clearly had a second act planned. And it arrived 10 minutes later with flashing lights reflecting off my pool water. The entire street felt it before we saw it. Curtains shifted, front doors cracked open, phones came out. A patrol SUV rolled slowly down the block and parked right in front of my house, like it was responding to a felony. And stepping out of the driver's seat, adjusting his duty belt with slow, deliberate confidence, was Karen's husband, uniform crisp, badge shining, the kind of entrance meant to send a message. Karen's posture changed instantly. The anger melted into smug satisfaction. She folded her arms and stepped aside like she'd just summoned a final boss. "Officer," she said loudly enough for 3 houses to hear, "this homeowner is refusing to comply with HOA regulations." Notice the wording. Not my neighbor, not even my name. Just this homeowner, like I was already a problem to be processed. Her husband didn't look at me first. He looked at her, then at the house, then at the pool, calculating, measuring the optics. He approached slowly, boots heavy against the pavement, stopping just short of the gate. "Sir," he began in that controlled law enforcement tone, "I've received a complaint regarding a violation of community rules. I'm going to need you to cooperate." Now here's the thing. There's a difference between enforcing law and flexing authority. And this wasn't about law. It was about intimidation dressed up in uniform. I asked him calmly what statute I was violating. Not HOA policy, not neighborhood preference. Actual law. There was a pause. A small one, but long enough for the neighbors watching to notice. Karen jumped in before he could answer. "He's being difficult," she snapped. "Just make him hand over the keys." That's when I saw it. The moment her husband realized this wasn't as simple as she'd made it sound. Because private property disputes aren't criminal matters. And he knew it. But pride is a powerful thing, especially when your spouse is standing behind you, expecting a show of force. He cleared his throat and tried again, firmer this time. "Sir, I suggest you resolve this quickly." That's when I stood up, slowly, calmly. No anger, no panic, just steady eye contact. And I said something that made the entire tone of the afternoon shift. "Officer, before this goes any further, you might want to see who you're actually talking to." The silence that followed, it wasn't neighborhood curiosity anymore. It was tension. The credentials reveal. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't just sit in the air. It presses down on everyone in it. That was the silence between us when I reached into my pocket. Not fast, not dramatic. Slow enough that the officer's hand instinctively hovered closer to his belt. Karen's confident smirk flickered for just half a second. She thought I was about to argue, maybe show a permit, maybe pull out some printed HOA bylaws like everyone else she'd steamrolled before. Instead, I pulled out a slim leather wallet and flipped it open. Not toward Karen, toward her husband. Up close, where only he could see it clearly. His eyes moved across the badge, then the ID, then back to my face. And in that split second, I watched authority recalibrate in real time. His shoulders straightened, not in dominance this time, but in recognition. The air shifted, his jaw tightened, and for the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. Karen leaned forward impatiently. "Well, arrest him if he's refusing," she demanded, loud enough for half the street to hear. But her husband didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Because what he was looking at wasn't an HOA violation. It wasn't a civilian bluff. It was federal credentials, real ones. The kind you don't question lightly. I lowered my voice just enough to keep it between us, calm, measured. "Officer, I respect your position, but this is a civil HOA dispute on private property. And I believe you know that." His throat moved as he swallowed. A subtle nod, almost invisible. The neighbors couldn't see it, but Karen could feel it. Her posture shifted again, confusion replacing certainty. "What is it?" she snapped. "What did he show you?" That's when he finally spoke, not to me, to her. "This isn't what you said it was." The words hit her like cold water. Her expression hardened, trying to regain control. "It doesn't matter who he thinks he is," she fired back. "Rules are rules." But here's what Karen didn't understand. This was never about who I thought I was. It was about who she assumed I wasn't. And assumptions? They're dangerous when you build power on them. Because the moment she tried to escalate beyond intimidation, she stepped into territory she couldn't manage. And what happened next didn't just embarrass her. It put her entire position on that HOA board at risk. Public authority collapse. Karen wasn't used to hesitation. She was used to doors opening, neighbors apologizing, and people folding the second she raised her voice. So when her own husband didn't immediately back her play, something inside her snapped. You could see it, the way her jaw tightened, the way her heels shifted against the concrete, like she was recalculating in real time. The neighbors were no longer casually watching. Now they were invested. Phones were visibly recording. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was a public power test. "Excuse me," she demanded, stepping closer to her husband. "What do you mean this isn't what I said it was?" Her tone wasn't confused, it was accusatory. And that's when the officer did something that completely changed the dynamic. He took one small step away from her. Not dramatic, not obvious, but deliberate. A physical separation. Uniform on one side, HOA ego on the other. "Ma'am," he said carefully, using a tone that was suddenly procedural instead of personal. "This is a civil matter. There is no criminal violation here." That word, "ma'am," hit harder than anything else. No honey, no supportive glance, just professional distance. The crowd murmured, subtle but noticeable. The illusion of united authority had cracked. Karen's face flushed red. "So you're just going to let him disrespect the HOA?" she pressed. And that's when I spoke, not louder, not aggressive, just clear enough for the entire front row of neighbors to hear. "No one is disrespecting anyone, but authority has limits." And that sentence hung in the air like a verdict. Because everyone there knew exactly what this was about. Karen had built her reputation on intimidation, warning letters, fines, threats of towing, public shaming in HOA meetings. Most people paid up or backed down because fighting wasn't worth the stress. But today, the script didn't work. The uniform she tried to weaponize had just refused to cooperate. Her husband adjusted his radio awkwardly. "We're done here," he said firmly, walking back toward the cruiser. Not fast, not embarrassed, just finished. And that's when panic flickered across Karen's face for the first time. Not anger, panic, because the crowd had seen it. The shift, the retreat, the loss of control. But here's the thing about people who thrive on power. They don't walk away quietly. They double down. And as Karen turned back toward me, voice shaking but louder than ever, I realized this confrontation wasn't ending. It was evolving, the meltdown that changed everything. The moment the patrol SUV door shut, something inside Karen completely unraveled. You could actually see it. The forced composure cracking under the weight of public embarrassment. The neighborhood wasn't whispering anymore. People were openly watching. One neighbor across the street had both hands on her phone, recording without even pretending otherwise. And Karen knew it. "This isn't over," she said, her voice louder now, not controlled, not polished, raw. "You think flashing some fake badge makes you untouchable? That word, fake, it was reckless, emotional, and very, very dangerous. Because accusing someone of impersonating federal authority in front of witnesses? That's not HOA drama. That's escalation into serious territory." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step toward her. I simply looked at her the way you look at someone who doesn't understand the line. "They've just crossed." "Be careful," I said calmly. Not threatening, not dramatic, just factual. And that calmness seemed to enrage her even more. She turned to the neighbors, gesturing wildly. "You all see this, right? He thinks he's above the rules. Above the board! Above the community. But here's what she miscalculated. This wasn't a closed HOA meeting room where she controlled the agenda. This was open daylight, public property, cameras out, witnesses everywhere. And instead of rallying behind her, the crowd looked uncomfortable. One older neighbor actually spoke up. "Karen, maybe this has gone far enough." That single sentence hit harder than anything I could have said, because it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from her base. And when people who once feared you start questioning you publicly, the foundation starts shaking. She spun back toward me, eyes blazing. "I will file a formal complaint. I will fine you. I will make sure this property is audited top to bottom." The threats weren't strategic anymore. They were desperate. And desperation leads to mistakes. Because the second she said audit, I realized something important. If she wanted scrutiny, if she wanted paperwork examined, if she wanted formal processes activated, that door swings both ways. And unlike Karen, I don't bluff when it comes to documentation. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the HOA board itself had vulnerabilities. Financial ones, procedural ones. And the moment she pushed this from ego to paperwork, she triggered a chain reaction she wouldn't be able to stop. The paper trail. Nobody expected. Karen thought the word audit was a threat. For me, it was an invitation. The second she stormed off my driveway, heels striking concrete like she'd just declared war, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Because here's something most people don't realize about HOAs. The louder the leadership talks about rules, the more you should quietly look at their paperwork. And I had already started looking. You see, months before this pool incident, small things didn't add up. Sudden maintenance surcharges, landscaping, contracts that mysteriously doubled in cost, emergency repair assessments with no competitive bids. I hadn't said anything then. I simply requested documents that politely, legally in writing. And under state law, HOAs are required to provide financial transparency to homeowners. They delayed. They deflected. They lost emails. That's always the first red flag. So when Karen screamed audit in front of half the neighborhood, she had no idea I already had a folder of my own. Digital copies, meeting minutes, budget discrepancies highlighted line by line, signatures that didn't quite match timelines, vendor addresses that traced back to interesting connections. The following morning, while she was probably drafting her dramatic violation notice, I filed a formal records demand through certified mail, not emotional, not aggressive, procedural, by the book. And when you approach power calmly and legally, it makes people far more nervous than shouting ever could. Within 48 hours, I noticed something unusual. The HOA portal went offline for maintenance. The weekly community newsletter delayed. A board meeting was suddenly rescheduled. When institutions start moving quietly, it usually means someone is scrambling behind the scenes. Neighbors began texting me privately. What's going on? Why is Karen acting weird? Did something happen with the budget? Word spreads fast in a suburban community, especially when control starts slipping. Then came the email, not from Karen, from the HOA treasurer. Short, formal, unexpected. We acknowledge receipt of your request. The board will comply within the statutory time frame. That's when I knew. This wasn't about pool keys anymore. This was about exposure. Because once financial records are opened under scrutiny, you can't control what people find. And if even one number doesn't line up, the same neighbors who watched her try to weaponize authority will start asking very different questions. Karen wanted escalation. She just accidentally upgraded it to forensic level, the board meeting detonation. If Karen thought she could contain the damage behind closed doors, she underestimated one thing. Curiosity spreads faster than gossip when money is involved. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the clubhouse. Normally maybe 6 people show up. Retirees, the usual loyal supporters. This time, the parking lot was full. Cars lined the curb. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years suddenly had questions. And when Karen walked in, red blazer back on like armor, she immediately realized the room didn't feel the same. The energy had shifted. Conversations stopped when she entered. Eyes followed her, not with fear but with evaluation. That's a dangerous change for someone who thrives on control. The treasurer sat stiffly at the end of the table, a thick stack of papers in front of him. He wasn't making eye contact. Karen called the meeting to order with forced confidence. We're here to address misinformation being spread in the community,
she began sharply.
Not even looking at me. Notice the framing. Misinformation. Classic power move. Attack credibility before facts surface. But then something unexpected happened. The treasurer cleared his throat. Soft sound. Loud impact. I think we should start with the financial document request, he said carefully. And just like that, the room leaned forward. Papers shuffled. Phones lifted again. Karen's expression tightened. That's not necessary, she cut in quickly. We'll handle that privately. Privately. Wrong answer. Because once transparency becomes public demand, privacy sounds like concealment. A neighbor stood up. If there's nothing wrong, why not show us? Another voice followed. Then another. The calm suburban tone was gone. This wasn't yelling, it was organized skepticism, and that's far more dangerous. The treasurer finally slid the top document forward. There are discrepancies that need clarification. His voice wavered slightly. That was the crack. The first visible fracture in Karen's command. What discrepancies? Someone asked from the back. And that's when the numbers were read out loud. Landscaping contracts renewed without board vote. A security upgrade billed at nearly triple market rate. A consulting fee paid to a company with a mailing address, suspiciously close to someone on the board. Gasps filled the room. Not dramatic, not theatrical, real. Karen tried to regain control. These are standard operational decisions, she snapped. But her voice no longer carried authority. It carried defense. And when leaders switch from commanding to defending, everyone feels it. Then the treasurer said the one sentence Karen never expected to hear in public. I recommend we consider an independent audit. The room went silent, because that wasn't my demand anymore. It was coming from inside the board. Karen had tried to embarrass one homeowner over pool keys. Instead, she had triggered a full-scale review of her leadership. And what happens when power gets audited publicly? Sometimes it doesn't survive the process, the vote that turned the tables. The word audit didn't just hang in the air, it split the room in two. You could almost feel people choosing sides in real time. Karen stood frozen for half a second, and in leadership terms, half a second is an eternity. Because when you hesitate during a challenge, the room senses weakness. This is ridiculous, she said sharply, trying to regain rhythm. We are not putting this association through unnecessary scrutiny. Because of one disgruntled homeowner. There it was again, framing me as the problem. But the narrative had already shifted. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about the numbers sitting on that table. A board member on the far end, someone who had barely spoken in past meetings, leaned into the microphone. With respect, transparency protects us. If everything is clean, an independent audit clears this up. That sentence landed like a hammer, because he was right. An audit doesn't destroy leadership. It validates it, unless leadership is afraid of what it might find. Karen's composure cracked just slightly. "You're overreacting," she insisted. But now she wasn't speaking to a loyal audience. She was speaking to homeowners who had just heard about inflated contracts and questionable approvals. The trust equation had changed. Then came the procedural motion, calm, formal, devastating. "I move that we vote to authorize an independent third-party audit of HOA finances for the past 2 fiscal years. Seconded immediately. No hesitation." The room buzzed. Karen's eyes scanned the board, searching for support, for loyalty, for someone to kill the motion. But loyalty weakens when risk enters the picture. No one wants their name attached to potential misconduct. The vote was called. Hands went up, one by one. Even one of Karen's longtime allies raised his hand, slowly, almost apologetically, but he raised it. Because self-preservation is stronger than friendship when liability is involved. The motion passed. Not narrowly, overwhelmingly. Karen's face went pale for just a fraction of a second before she forced a tight smile. "Fine," she said stiffly, "if that's what the board wants." But that smile didn't reach her eyes, because she knew what everyone else was just beginning to understand. Once an independent auditor steps in, control disappears. The documents don't spin. The numbers don't argue. They just reveal. And here's the part that truly shifted the balance. A homeowner from the back of the room stood up and said, "While we're voting, maybe we should also discuss leadership accountability." That wasn't anger. That was momentum. Karen had tried to take my pool keys. Now the room was quietly considering taking her position. And once removal enters the conversation in a public meeting, it rarely leaves quietly. The motion no one saw coming. You could feel it before it was said. That subtle shift in the room, when frustration turns into decision. Erin was still standing at the front table, hands pressed flat against the wood, like she could physically hold control in place. The audit vote had passed. The room hadn't exploded. There was no chaos. And somehow that made it worse. Because calm rooms make calculated choices. Then the same homeowner who mentioned leadership accountability didn't sit back down. He stayed standing, steady, measured. "I'd like to introduce a motion," he said clearly, projecting just enough to command the room, "to begin formal proceedings for removal of the HOA president pending the results of the audit." The air left the room. Even Karen didn't interrupt immediately. It was like her brain needed a second to process what she'd just heard. Removal wasn't gossip. It wasn't social backlash. It was structural, procedural, legal. Within the bylaws, she loved quoting at everyone else. "That's completely inappropriate." She finally snapped, voice sharp and defensive. "You can't just remove an elected officer because of rumors." But here's the thing. This wasn't a removal vote. Not yet. It was a motion to begin proceedings. And the bylaws? They allowed it. Ironically, the same rulebook Karen had weaponized for years was now being opened against her. Another board member spoke carefully. "The motion is to initiate review, not to remove immediately." The tone was neutral, professional, and that neutrality made it lethal. Because it wasn't emotional retaliation, it was governance. Karen turned to the treasurer. "You're seriously entertaining this?" He didn't answer right away. That silence said everything. Phones were still recording. Neighbors weren't whispering anymore. They were watching history unfold in real time. A suburban HOA meeting had just turned into a leadership reckoning. The motion required a second, and without hesitation, in it came. Seconded. The procedural steps were read aloud. Review committee formation. Temporary oversight limitations. Financial access adjustments pending audit findings. Each sentence stripped away a little more control. Karen's confidence was gone now. What remained was disbelief. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the enforcer, the rule keeper, the one others feared challenging. Instead, she was standing at the front of a room where her authority was being reduced line by line. The vote to initiate proceedings was called. Hands rose again. Slower this time, heavier, but they rose. The motion passed. And just like that, the woman who had marched onto my property demanding pool keys was now facing a formal review of her own leadership. But here's the twist no one in that room expected. The audit hadn't even started yet. And when auditors begin digging, they don't stop at surface discrepancies, the first shock of the audit. The audit didn't take long. Professional, quiet, methodical, the kind of work that doesn't need cameras or social media hype. It speaks for itself. But when the preliminary findings arrived at the HOA office, the atmosphere changed overnight. Karen walked into the clubhouse the next morning thinking she could still control the narrative. She thought she could manage optics, maybe spin the numbers in her favor. She couldn't have been more wrong. The lead auditor began presenting the initial results to the board in a small conference room, a spreadsheet here, a bank statement there, expenses labeled miscellaneous that weren't so miscellaneous after all. Contracts renewed without approval, money diverted to shell companies. Every line item was a nail in a coffin of her authority. The board members, who had been tentative before, now exchanged glances, barely concealing disbelief. Karen tried to interject, to explain, to soften it all with vague phrases about operational necessities and emergency approvals, but the auditors didn't react. Numbers are deaf to excuses. Facts don't negotiate. The room felt colder, heavier, as each discrepancy was read aloud. And then came the kicker, the one number that made her hands tremble and her face go pale, a six-figure payment, labeled as community improvement, had been routed to an address linked directly to one of her closest allies on the board. And there was no paper trail, no signed contracts, no bids, nothing to justify it. Just a large sum of money that shouldn't have existed. The room went silent, not the polite hush of attention, but a stunned, collectively holding your breath kind of silence. Karen's voice cracked when she finally spoke. There must be a mistake. But mistakes don't explain deliberate patterns. The auditors looked at her, professional and unblinking. The findings are accurate to the best of our ability, the lead auditor said. The moment that sentence landed, you could see it in the eyes of everyone present. The board, the neighbors, Karen herself. The power had shifted completely. Authority she had wielded like a weapon was now vulnerable. Every threat, every intimidating letter, every fine she had levied on residents came back to haunt her. And just like that, the woman who once demanded pool keys and citations now found herself in the hot seat, facing consequences far beyond what she could control. Because in the game of HOA drama, paperwork doesn't lie, and neither do witnesses. Karen's desperate confrontation backfires. By the time Karen realized the audit wasn't going to go her way, desperation had fully taken hold. She stormed out of the conference room, slamming doors behind her, heels clacking like a warning siren across the tile floor. Her hands shook slightly, and her voice, once commanding, now wavered with panic. "This is ridiculous. I demand this be corrected immediately," she shouted, spinning toward the board. But the board had changed. The same people who had once nodded silently at her every word were now standing firm, eyes locked on her, refusing to be intimidated. "Karen," one board member said carefully, "the auditors are professionals. We cannot interfere with their findings." Another added, "We have to follow procedure. That's the only way to protect the community." The sentences hit like hammers. Authority was slipping through her fingers in real time. Noticing neighbors still lingering outside the clubhouse, she tried a show of dominance, yelling, gesturing, attempting to portray control. But the audience had already seen the shift. Phones were out, cameras recording, witnesses observing every tremor in her confidence. Every desperate attempt to flex authority was magnified, making her appear weaker, not stronger. She lunged toward the treasurer, pointing an accusatory finger. "You're conspiring against me," she screamed. But the treasurer didn't react. Calm, neutral, professional, Karen's strategy of fear and intimidation had turned on her. Every threat, every claim of rule enforcement now appeared petty, self-serving and reckless. Her final move was a Hail Mary. threatening legal action against the auditors and the board, hoping fear of litigation would make them back down. But she miscalculated. The board had lawyers on standby. Every step she had taken in trying to control the HOA had been documented. Every threat she made was now evidence of misconduct, procedural overreach, and abuse of power. By the end of the confrontation, Karen was no longer in control of her HOA. The room wasn't hostile. It was procedural, inevitable, and relentless. And the neighbors, who had once feared her wrath over trivial infractions, now whispered among themselves, realizing that the same woman who demanded obedience had finally met her match. In law, in procedure, and in public scrutiny, her meltdown hadn't restored power. It had exposed it, every flaw, every vulnerability, every misstep, and the fallout was only beginning. Evidence escalates and the neighborhood reacts. By now, word had spread beyond the clubhouse walls. Neighbors who had been quietly observing from their windows. Porches and driveways were talking, messaging, even posting snippets on community chat groups. What had started as a single backyard confrontation over pool keys had snowballed into a full-blown HOA scandal, complete with financial discrepancies, board accountability motions, and Karen's public meltdown. The auditors were thorough, delivering evidence in layers, line item reports, contract copies, bank transfers, emails showing unapproved decisions. Each document added weight to the growing tension. Some of the numbers were small, a few $100s here or there, but patterns emerged, showing repeated mismanagement. And when neighbors saw the summaries posted in the digital newsletter, whispers turned into outrage. Families who once feared Karen's fines and threats began comparing notes. Did she really do this? One neighbor asked another. I paid extra for landscaping last year and now I see the contracts doubled. Phones started buzzing non-stop with screenshots and messages. By evening, small groups had gathered on sidewalks, porches and street corners, quietly debating the scandal. Children played in the background, unaware while adults quietly assessed the woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with intimidation. Karen attempted damage control. She drafted letters, tried to post clarifications in the HOA portal, and called board members individually to plead for support. None of it worked. Every attempt to spin the narrative failed because the evidence didn't lie. Public perception had already shifted, and neighbors could now see her actions in real time. It wasn't chaos yet, not physically. At least, but socially, Karen's reign had fractured. Her allies whispered nervously during board meetings, hesitant to defend her too loudly. Her credibility, once unshakable in the neighborhood, was now questioned by even those who had once obeyed her unquestioningly. And here's the brutal truth. Karen couldn't face. The pool key confrontation that began as a petty power move had triggered a domino effect. By challenging a single homeowner, she had inadvertently revealed a system of oversight failures that she herself had contributed to, and the neighborhood was now watching, ready to hold her accountable. The legal hammer falls. The moment Karen realized the neighborhood had turned against her, she thought she could fight back with legal threats, letters, emails, citations, but this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was about law, procedure, and accountability. The HOA's own rules had been weaponized against her, and now real legal scrutiny was arriving at her doorstep. A few days after the board meeting, certified letters started arriving, formal notices from the auditors, legal representatives, and even municipal oversight officers. Each one carefully worded, factual, and undeniable. The discrepancies in the finances weren't allegations. Anymore, they were documented evidence. Every signature, every contract, every payment was verified. There was no room for bluffing. Karen tried to fight back in her typical style, calling meetings, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits. But every attempt was met with calm, professional responses. The board had legal counsel. The auditors had records. Even neighbors who had once feared her were now empowered by the transparency she had failed to control. Social pressure compounded the legal weight. Community members, now armed with facts and documents, began asking pointed questions at HOA meetings and online forums. Why wasn't this approved properly? Who authorized these payments? Why was our money mismanaged? Each question cut deeper, exposing not just mismanagement, but a pattern of abuse. By the time she hired lawyers to push back, the damage was already done. What was supposed to be a private, humiliating confrontation over pool keys had escalated into full legal exposure. The same energy she had tried to use to intimidate neighbors now worked against her. Procedural, methodical and unstoppable. Karen had thought she could control the narrative. She had thought that authority, yelling and fear could override facts. But in this neighborhood, backed by evidence and law, she discovered a hard truth. Real power doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from rules, transparency, and the people who enforce them. The neighborhood revolt, and Karen's final desperate moves. By now the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The confrontation that began over a single backyard pool key had evolved into a full-blown rebellion against Karen's authority. Neighbors, who once silently obeyed her, now openly questioned her decisions. Sidewalks became impromptu discussion spots. Group chats exploded with screenshots, evidence, and comparisons of past fines and suspicious charges. Even those who had once been neutral were now leaning toward action. And Karen could feel it. She tried to strike back. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, letters in mailboxes, pleading explanations and vague apologies. She called late-night HOA emergency meetings, hoping to intimidate or persuade. Every effort, however, backfired. People weren't intimidated anymore. They were informed. Each flyer only reminded everyone of the discrepancies. Each meeting only highlighted how isolated she had become. Her desperation reached a peak when she attempted to call an emergency neighborhood vote to reinstate her control. She expected shock and compliance. Instead, the community called her bluff. They insisted on waiting for the audit results. They demanded transparency. They even began forming informal committees to ensure no unilateral decisions could be made. And here's the cruel irony. The woman who had once wielded fear like a weapon now found herself powerless in the face of collective action. The same tactics she had used to dominate the streets, threats, intimidation, loud arguments, now amplified her vulnerability. Neighbors were no longer afraid. They were vigilant. Karen's face, once a mask of confidence and control, now displayed desperation. Her last moves, pleading, threatening, trying to twist procedures, only cemented the realization that she had lost not just the board, but the trust of an entire community. Every observer, every neighbor, every witness now understood the truth. The pool key incident wasn't the beginning. It was the tipping point that ended her reign. The grand finale, Karen's ultimate fallout. By the time the audit was complete and the final report circulated, Karen's HOA reign had crumbled entirely. The numbers were undeniable. Contracts mismanaged, funds misappropriated, unilateral decisions made without board approval. The evidence was concrete, procedural and public. The board formally moved to remove her as president, and the neighborhood, once fearful, now quietly celebrated the shift. Karen tried one last stand, storming into the clubhouse with red-faced fury, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, and waving folders as if paperwork could reverse reality. But the room had shifted irreversibly. Board members now acted independently, backed by auditors and legal counsel. Neighbors were no longer silent witnesses. They were participants in holding leadership accountable. Every attempt to intimidate was met with calm, legal, and procedural pushback. Even the casual observers on the street understood the scale of the defeat. Cameras, phones, and social media posts captured the entire unraveling. Every tremor of anger, every faltering argument, every desperate plea. Karen's public persona of control and authority was gone. Where there had once been fear, there was scrutiny. Where there had been intimidation, there was accountability. And the final, undeniable lesson hung in the air, like the stillness after a storm. One woman's attempt to seize control over a backyard pool key had escalated into a full-scale accountability movement. Authority built on fear is fragile. Transparency is powerful. And when a community unites, even the loudest, most aggressive figure can fall. Karen's legacy wasn't victory. It was a cautionary tale, immortalized in whispers, screenshots, and boardroom minutes, that in the game of HOA power, underestimating a single determined homeowner can bring an empire crashing down. At the end, for Karen,